Well, everybody, welcome. So I'll just straight away welcome my guest here, my speakers. Katarina Lump from the UNHCR representative in Turkey. Mukesh Kapila, Professor of Global Health and Humanitarian Affairs from University of Manchester. And Chris Lockyear, Secretary General of Doctors Without Borders. Thank you very much for coming.
You sit under your picture. You sit under your picture, so it's okay.
Yes, so a brief introduction to this panel will focus on topics and trends in humanitarian aid, and the primary objective of humanitarian aid is to save lives, which has many obstacles to it. So we will shed here some light with our speakers, and I introduced them, but I introduced them again. Katarina Lump here with us, and Mukesh Kapila, and also Chris Lockyear. Thank you very much for coming. So I start straight away with a lady, of course, here with us. So. I mean, we are at a time where there are more people displaced or refugees since the Second World War, and I mean, that was coming to terms with the most devastating events of history and struggles. So to have a better understanding, why has it increased? Why are we at that point?
Well, indeed, we are seeing a 5 years continued upward trend of forced displacement, and that's displacement only related to war, persecution, human rights violation, to conflict, not displacement related to natural disasters. And it's interesting looking at, if you look closer at what this increase entails and what the characteristics are, you have altogether 2/3 of all refugees, that is people displaced across an international border, not those displaced internally, which are always a much larger group than those who cross borders and become refugees. Worldwide, over 2/3 come from only 5 countries. And that's the 5 main causes for displacement that need to be resolved and tackled before we see a reduction. That's the Syria situation, which remains by far the largest refugee situations, with 6.3 million Syrians displaced in the region, but also beyond. That's Myanmar, the situation that has displaced and made refugees large numbers of Rohingyas. That's the South Sudan. And then that's 2 very long, protracted conflict situations. That's Afghanistan and Somalia. So these 5 countries of origin, the conflicts, the situation there is caused to over 2/3 of the world's refugees. So resolving those conflicts would reduce this number significantly. Then if we look, another important feature and really staggering is that the 10 countries worldwide that host the largest number of refugees, first of all, they include 4 of the world's least developed countries, and they host 63% of the world's refugees. So there is 10 countries hosting close to 2/3 of the world's refugees, and there's 5 situations causing more than 2/3 of the world's refugee population. And this situation perpetuates, and the challenges are a lack of solutions, the protracted nature of many conflicts. Syria, the situation where many of us thought, and including many Syrians, thought they would be able to return after a year or 2. Now it's in its 8th year. The situation in Afghanistan, causing over the last close to 20 years renewed displacement and no real settlement of the conflict. And then we do have this lack of international solidarity and responsibility sharing when it's only 10 countries who bear the bulk of the responsibility for this situation. And then Another big challenge, it was mentioned in the previous panel, is that the needs really have grown, and the gap between the needs and the resources, the humanitarian funding has grown, which is also linked to the fact that in many refugee situations, we get stuck with humanitarian short-term aid, and we create dependency, and we don't invest sufficiently in self-reliance, so that people are able to live a self-reliant life in dignity in the country that they are hosted, but which also prepares them for another solution for eventually also for return.
So that was a nice opening, and also we will underline some of the issues that you have raised here deeper, but talking about those 5 regions, it's good to go on the ground and to have a better understanding, to know what obstacles people are facing. So I will continue with Chris there, as your Doctors Without Borders is doing an incredible job in many regions, and you are facing many challenges, many difficulties, and I think the important thing is probably when it's coming to saving lives, acting quickly, responding quickly, and the emergency itself. So what are the main challenges there on the ground?
Yeah, thanks. I think one of the main contemporary challenges that we're finding and we're noticing in several areas of the world is the idea that people seeking assistance and those trying to provide humanitarian assistance are themselves becoming, for want of a better word, criminalized. And we see this in various areas of our operations. There's 3 that we have ongoing at the moment. We have the situation of search and rescue in the Mediterranean. I think it's well known by a lot of people in this room that the ship that we work with, the Aquarius, is currently forcibly docked in Marseille and is flagless. It can't sail. But that's the sort of the culmination of a recent, very difficult history with these activities. Just over the summer, there was a moment where 630 people who'd been rescued at sea were unable to disembark in Europe and had to be turned back to Libya, where they returned to their lives in various detention centers. This has included, of course, pregnant women and children. And so having a very direct, immediate impact on people we're trying to assist. There's also the case just a few weeks ago in Nauru, just off the coast of Australia, where we were asked to stop assisting people there when it came to, we were working with a mental health program. And the statistics are quite alarming in that a third of the people that we spoke to had said that they had actively had suicidal thoughts. So a really traumatic situation, people fleeing but then detained and no longer being able to seek refuge. Why were we stopped from operating? We were stopped from basically talking about this situation and exposing the situation for people seeking refuge off the coast of Australia. And the final example that I'll give is regarding it was just mentioned, the migrant caravan in Central America. And this is a very difficult problem to describe. It's something of people getting sort of trapped in a vortex between violence and hope on one hand, also trying to find a new life out of narco smuggling, but also looking at hope in terms of getting to the US. And many of these people are labeled as terrorists and criminals themselves, but many of them have no option other than to seek removal from their current situation. So it's not all voluntary. It's not all just economic by any means. And we're finding that both ourselves as a humanitarian actor, but people seeking assistance are becoming criminalized, and it becomes very difficult to act according to the humanitarian principles, according to a humanitarian impulse, when that act itself, the act of trying to care, is itself becoming criminalized.
And taking from there, well, Mukesh Kapila, you said once in an interview that, I mean, the ones who bear the conflict most are the local doctors, local nurses, and the local people because they're there before the conflict, during the conflict, and after the conflict. So, for solutions, for local solutions, what could be more effective?
Well, I think if I can approach it indirectly by saying first that the narrative of endless wars, increasing disasters, massively increasing needs, and therefore not enough resources to meet them is now becoming so familiar, so repeated as to become almost boring. And I think the point here is that normally in life, if a problem cannot be solved by banging your head against a brick wall, all it gives you is a headache, you try and go somewhere else. So I'm struck by some of the debate on this, and I'll come to your question indirectly, by simply saying, at last we are discovering, because we have not as much money as we would like, because outsiders can't come in and solve the world's problems, by force we are having to discover the importance of local action. Now for centuries, for millennia perhaps, local people have been the first responders. By the time international aid comes in, however well-meaning it is almost too late because most of the relief efforts are carried out by local people. Now, in coming to your question, in the case of healthcare, absolutely, local healers and are more trusted. They are present when the crisis or the disaster or the conflict strikes. And whether they are doctors or nurses or whether they are the informal community of healers, they're always the first responders. Now, luckily, we live in an age of technology where we can do much more to help them. Whether it is through distant techniques, and I'm not here talking about video conferencing with sophisticated technology, I'm talking about very humble Skype. I have seen surgery being performed locally in Syria under guidance from a surgeon by non-surgeons operating under Skype guidance as to where to cut and where to drain and all those kinds of things. So technology is one thing. The second thing that we can do much more about is actually having more trust in local people. Now, when militaries bomb communities, some innocent people get killed, and we consider that collateral damage. But when we try and put more resources into local communities, then the world talks about, oh, that's corruption. We can't trust them. But I'm afraid some element of diversion is natural, is a cost of doing business if you really want to localize. One of the disappointing things about this whole business is we met in this very city 2 years ago at the World Humanitarian Summit, and I was there, and we ranted and raved about localization. Actually, the amount of progress that's been made in 2 years since the summit has been infinitesimally small. And therefore, I'm afraid the question I have to throw back is, it's not that localization is not important and locals are not the best initial providers and long-term providers as well, when outsiders can't have access. That's self-evident. But to really explore how come we are running a humanitarian system, a global humanitarian system, that is not just broke, as is often claimed, but is broken. Okay. Because it stops local providers. It stops, disincentivizes local carers in providing humanitarian relief.
I think Katerina wanted to add something to the broke or broken system, but before coming to that, are you saying humanitarian players are not searching for local solutions yet?
How can they? I mean, Turkeys don't vote for Christmas as expression. The global humanitarian system is reliant on a monopoly of major multi-billion-dollar institutions. And with due respect to my friends here, they belong to those institutions as well. And don't take this in a disrespectful way. When your whole livelihood and your system of working is reliant on a humanitarian monopoly of global institutions, and the gap between when you're sitting at the top on a high-level floor in Geneva or New York to where it is on the ground, even a telescope will not allow you to see. So I'm afraid it is time to be honest, if you like. Now let's come back to the Red Cross. After all, that's what we're here for, 150th anniversary of the Red Crescent here. And Kızılay has been at the foundation of the greatest of all humanitarian movements. Ultimately, what was the Red Cross Red Crescent system? It is fundamentally a collection of national societies and local communities. But what happens over time is that these things get globalized. And one of the aspects of globalization, unfortunately, is centralization. So I want to actually open up this discussion a little more with your permission, if I may, and say, let's be honest. The current system cannot allow more agency, more resources, more effort being put on local actors because it is a threat to the global monopoly of international organizations that we all make a very nice living from.
Okay, then I think we should talk about what needs to be done then, if we're making this statement. So, Katarina, I'll move on to you from there.
I would
disagree.
You would disagree?
No, I would maybe say that the world is learning, and it's learning maybe slower than we would want to. But we do see, and we did see, not surprisingly, when the Syrian crisis moved beyond the region towards Europe, that there was all of a sudden attention that was not there before, and there was, from our perspective, an important step forward in the New York Declaration for Refugees and Migrants, where maybe you would say that also that is not sufficient, and this is something that should have happened much further. But it, from our perspective, is a set of commitments to really improve the way we respond to large movements of refugees and of migrants, and it has a number of not so new elements, but for the first time agreed in consensus by 193 states. So from that perspective, the world and states and all of us do learn. Just to mention a few of them that have already changed the way in which we are able to work. With the New York Declaration, and the aim in terms of the refugee response is to have more predictable and equitable burden and responsibility sharing between states. It places emphasis on self-reliance, on moving away from humanitarian assistance, except in a very initial phase. It emphasizes the need to not only address the humanitarian needs of refugees, but support host countries and host states and host communities, and brings in a whole set of new actors, explicitly mentioned, what one could describe as a whole of society approach that involves not only local humanitarian actors, but also the private sector, international financial institutions. It allows us to raise awareness and also raise support for systems, national systems in host countries and host communities. And we've seen that following this New York Declaration and the discussions among states and actors to move towards a more comprehensive, a more predictable and a more shared responsibility for refugees, we've seen indeed quite some improvements in the way in which also much stronger actors than humanitarian actors have come into play in the response. So maybe that's not like the discussion about localization at the World Humanitarian Summit. That has moved incrementally. It has indeed moved. Maybe also the New York Declaration is a set of commitments that will need to prove its value moving forward. But it's an important step, and it's a consensus among all the member states of the United Nations.
Maybe, Katarina, sorry to interrupt you there, just to add on, as you are the representative in Turkey of here, and you've witnessed the whole situation with the Syrian refugees, and we are seeing that it's in its 8th year of conflict, and Turkey is the largest hosting refugee countries. So in those 8 years, how it's dealt with, especially when it comes to terms with putting up camps or water, sanitation, health, what have we learned from those 8 years?
I mean, Turkey, the refugee response in Turkey, which has been, I think, is recognized globally as being rather unique and impressive, is characterized by the fact that Turkey has adopted, when numbers of refugees were already somewhere between 1 and 2 million, has adopted a very comprehensive legal framework for international and temporary protection. So, and this legal framework envisages the inclusion of refugees in national systems. So you have, meanwhile, more than 150 migrant health centers that are part of the public health system where Syrians and other refugees can access healthcare. You have, meanwhile, more than 600, I think 80,000 Syrian children being enrolled in the formal education system here in Turkey. So Turkey's response is one of inclusion, and in fact the law envisages a very interesting principle, which is the principle of harmonization, which envisages that, in short, envisages an approach by which Turkish citizens and foreigners and refugees can live in harmony, and refugees are enabled to live independent of the assistance of third parties. So very much also in the vein of the New York Declaration, really an investment towards enabling self-reliance of refugees.
Mm-hmm. And talking about refugees, well, Chris, from your experience on the ground there, looking at the victims, the people who actually suffer who are there, what about their traumas they're facing? What are the challenges there? What needs to be done?
I think it's. I mean, I think it's important to look at whatever the crisis. I think it's very important to be undogmatic when we're looking at what people experience and what they face. And this is. Everybody's experience is unique from even within the same conflict, but I think in terms of what people are telling us in various conflicts is that increasingly fleeing itself is becoming harder. So going from a position of wanting to being scared enough to being frightened enough to want to actually move yourself and your family somewhere, they're finding more and more obstacles to doing that. It's a very difficult thing to generalize, so I feel a little bit uncomfortable in saying it. But there is increasingly, we find, a state control and sovereignty that is exercised, which is not allowing people to cross borders as freely as they would like, which then obviously compounds the situation. If you are scared enough to want to flee in the first place, and then you can't, that's, you know, I mean, it's almost unimaginable for me at least to be in that situation where I want to move my family and then I want to go to all that effort and I still can't. So I think that some of these dynamics are changing a little bit. I just wanted to respond a bit to the comments in terms of the narrative about the worst ever humanitarian crisis, and I fully agree with that aspect. I think we lose meaning when we overgeneralize and when we say things are worse and worse and worse. And I think that if something is, we are going to say that we're facing the worst or the most humanitarian crises ever, then we need to be very sure that we've got evidence to say that. And I think that's a very hard thing to get. Just to pick up a little bit on the broken system narrative and the localization narrative. Well, the broken system narrative has been dogmatic and ongoing for many years as well. That itself is also not a new discussion. I think it's very difficult in a session like this to be constructive in terms of fixing the system. I mean, because nobody knows what the system actually is. We had the discussion this morning, in the keynote speech this morning, about the ecosystem, which is, I think, a better description of what is faced, but still defining a system is very difficult. But I would say the one thing that needs to happen to shift is basically giving up control, and that means a very positive effort for these multi-billion organizations, and I would just make a caveat that I don't think we are dependent on them, but I don't want to talk about us so much. But we need to ensure that people are given responsibility. And now this is a very easy thing to say, because every time money is handed down, there's an extra layer of control and accountability there, which people have to respond to. And fundamentally, there are some major donors in the world that control what happens. But until we allow, and this may mean going back to domestic legislation, to actually look at benign things like forms on donor proposals and boxes and certain things like this, to be able to allow people to make decisions closer to the field, then I think we're not really tackling the problem. It has to be a willingness to give up control, and that's a very uncomfortable thing for a lot of these institutions.
Okay, well, in 30 minutes, we have to discuss many obstacles and trends and topics, so we don't have enough time, I know that. But you talked also about the dynamics, so I will move on with dynamics of conflicts and change. And we are witnessing new forms of violence. So, Dr. Mukesh, even, chemical attacks today, how should the humanitarian players tackle and adapt to these changes, to these dynamics?
I think, certainly, as you say, the patterns of conflict are changing. And I'm afraid the world at the moment is getting nastier and nastier. And this is going to remain for some time before the cycle turns again. Now, what struck me from the introduction when we heard about the history of Kızılay 150 years ago is the huge courage shown by humanitarians of that age and subsequent ages. And it's also struck me, I was reading just recently that last year was a record-breaking year for the number of journalists killed at the front lines of reporting, right? So from that grew a sad thought, and that is, are we as humanitarians becoming more cowardly? Somehow in today's world, we seem to think that humanitarianism is conducted by organizations, and it is often done in such a way as to actually minimize risk. So my answer to your question is that we need to rediscover our courage. This is not to discount the hundreds of thousands of people who are providing humanitarian help with great courage, at great risk to themselves, and we celebrate them and we commemorate them. But in structural terms, in system terms, I think we're becoming much more risk averse. So in order to address the question of how do we address the changing patterns of conflict in a world with wars without apparent end, I think we have to recognize that it is time to actually stand up and it's time to take risks more. If certain principles are worth struggling for, like humanitarian principles, the principles of humanity, then I'm afraid that the same principles are worth dying for. Now, that's a very harsh conclusion that I'm coming to, and I don't mean it quite like that. But what I mean to say is that if you really want humanitarians to respond adequately to the rising challenges in very confused and chaotic circumstances, then I'm afraid it's going to require sacrifice. It is going to require displays of courage and bravery that we have not yet seen in recent years, regardless of the individuals who are very definitely very courageous, and we've got many examples of that. So this is my answer. We need more courage, we need less risk averseness, and we need organizational adaptation that allows those risks to be taken by institutions and celebrates the individuals who are willing to sacrifice and to take this forward.
Okay, I'll take that as your final remarks and have also Katarina Lum's and Chris Lockyear's final remarks on this panel, as we only have a minute left. So, Katarina Lum.
Very short. I do think that what is needed and what we have actually seen, we have seen it when these large movements of refugees arrived here, when they moved to other countries. What we've seen is solidarity between peoples and an outpouring of spontaneous volunteerism, and the whole societies who responded. So I think what we need in the face of the challenges and the increasing challenges is solidarity between states, to share responsibility and solidarity between peoples, and a culture and from politicians, from government that fosters that and that does not easily let it turn into politics and exclusion and the other.
So Chris Lockyear.
Thanks. I would end with a word of caution when it comes to looking at trends, particularly global trends, and the notion of global trends in themselves, because most of these trends manifest themselves very different locally and have very different solutions locally. And I don't necessarily mean at a village level, but it can be at a regional level or a country level as well. So my word of caution is really one about dogmatism and the comfort that we find ourselves in when we can paint a global trend without looking at how this manifests for people and for operations in a specific location. We can lull ourselves into a false sense of security if we say we have a global trend without local evidence.
Well, thank you very much also. Chris Lockyear here with us, Secretary General of Doctors Without Borders, and Mukesh Kapila, Professor of Global Health and Humanitarian Affairs from University of Manchester, and Katerina Lump here with us, representative in Turkey of UNHCR. Thank you very much for joining this panel.
Thank you.
Thank you.